Ladies and gentlemen, tonight is truly a special evening. It's Erev Shabbos Parshas Zachor, and 8 months ago when we were planning this evening, when we were planning what this evening would look like, who knew where we would be? The topic that was chosen for tonight, and tonight's very special shir, night of inspiration and chizuk, is finding God at times of uncertainty, Purim. Who would have known how appropriate that would be for today's events and our season right now. I'd like to take a special moment to thank our sponsors, Elliot and Marilyn Lauer, who are making this event, single-handedly making this event available and possible for us. I want to just say a special thing, and that is that Elliot and Marilyn are people who express the notion of ayin tova. Have a good eye. Whenever I need to feel a little bit of chizuk, I just go to speak to Marilyn. I feel like I'm $1 million afterwards. Whenever Elliot sees something good, he doesn't want to just keep it for himself, he shares it with the rest of the world. And that's why we're here this evening. The Lauers love Rabbi Jacobson, and so they wanted to share him with the rest of us as well. What is chus? Tonight's learning is going to be Le'ilu Nishmas, both Elliot's parents and Marilyn's parents. Le'ilu Nishmas Gershon ben Eლიעזר and Dvora bas Moshe Yosef, George and Doris Lauer of blessed memory, and Yehuda bas Yitzchak, Gdalya and Yehudis Liebä bas Simcha, הכוהן, Dr. Edward and Judith Steinberg, builders of communities each in their own rights. And of course, tonight is a night where we wish Elliot and Marilyn would be with us here, but they are actually across the sea and are sitting by our friend, their son, Sam, Simcha Yitzchak ben Mirela Leyatkah, who grew up in our shul and just underwent some very serious surgery last week. And Baruch Hashem, the surgery was successful, and be'ezras Hashem, we should continue to hear good results. refuah, shleimah, and I'd like to start off, as before we start our learning, just to perhaps, if everybody could join me in one kapitel Tehillim. And usually we don't say Tehillim, Tachanunim at night, but the world is in a strange place right now. The world is in a place of difficulty, both globally and personally, and so perhaps we'll say one kapitel as a refuah shleimah and as a achenu kol beis Yisrael as we continue to learn together. Please join me, if you could just rise for a moment, for kapitel Kuf Chav Aleph. Shir la'ma'alois, esa enai el heharim me'ayin, yavoy ezri. Ezri me'im Adonai yoseh shamayim v'oretz. Al yitein la'moch raglecha, al yonum shomerecha. Hinei lo yonum v'lo yishon shomer Yisrael. Adonai shomerecha, Adonai tzilecha al yad yiminecha. Yomam hashemesh lo yakeka v'yareach ba'layla. Adonai yishmorcha mikol ra yishmor es nafshecha. Adonai yishmor tzeisecha uvoecha me'ata ve'ad olam. Mishaberach avosenu Yitzchak Yaakov yivorech yirapes hachoyle Simcha Yitzchak Mirela Leyatkah avu shanach mispallim ba'avuroi b'schaz HaKadosh Baruch Hu yimay rachim olav lach limor rapes olachaz kol chayosai shlach lamei refuah shleimah nashamayim nirmach v'oshesag gidol b'say shachar Yisrael refuah nefesh refuah guf hashtag bagla ziman kariv and amar. Amen. I want to thank special representatives of the Lauer family who are here in the regular makomos kavuim in our shul to be representing the family in Mr. Hashem. This should be a moment of inspiration, and it really truly is. We thank Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson for joining us in our shul. This is really truly a honor and a privilege. I won't go around the room by asking or embarrassing everybody to put up their hands right now, but just how many of our lives have been transformed and uplifted by Rabbi Jacobson in his incredible ability to translate Torah ideas into the world that we live in. Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson is an individual who has inspired and continued to inspire, both through the yeshiva.net with thousands of Talmidim around the world, or it is simply as being an ambassador, an expression of what it means to be a Jew and be able to talk and to be able to explain and be able to illuminate in the darkest of places. Rabbi Jacobson grew up at the feet of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zchus Yagen Aleinu, and is the only religious keynote speaker who has spoken at the U.S. Military Chief of Chaplains of the National Security Agency. He's named the Jewish Billy Graham for his speeches. And kvoida b'mukayim hamunach, I think it's much more. That's a diminution. Rabbi Jacobson is a voice. Our Torah is a voice of what it means to be a religious Jew and a voice of what it means to think about issues, complicated issues, and give expression to this world. B'chavod Rav, it's my great pleasure to welcome Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson to our show.
Thank you so much. Am I supposed to put this on, or we could leave it here? Thank you so much, my dear friend Rabbi Yaakov Shlita, and B'Rishus Rav, Rabbi Trump, and B'Rishus all of you. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I guess our topic, finding God during times of uncertainty, when the rabbi of the committee chose the topic, I think we were certain that we knew what type of evening it's going to be, but sometimes your very title becomes predictable of the only thing that is really predictable, which is that things are unpredictable. And a few weeks ago, when we discussed the title, I thought of various things to say. I was putting together my thoughts and ideas, and then just a few days ago, Thursday, Parshas Vayakel, Chav Daled Adar Aleph, the world suddenly changes. For some of us, it's personal. I think for all the Jewish people, it's very personal, because Ukraine is not just some territory, but Ukraine has more than 1,000 years of Jewish history. There's probably not a centimeter there that is not drenched with Jewish blood. And the amount of light and darkness that the Jewish people experienced there over a millennium is incredibly profound. Some of the greatest luminaries of Jewish history emerged from there. So some of the most pulsating and vibrant Jewish movements born and bred in Ukraine. And probably there's no community of Jews in the world that suffered so much as Jews of Ukraine. Until today, people don't realize that there are close to 400,000 or 350,000 Jews in Ukraine. So it's something that is not just a crisis for a world, which is of course true, but also touches us very, very deeply. When we talk about finding God in places of uncertainty, it really touches upon one of those great challenges that we all have in life. And that is, most of us are born, we grew up, and there's a certain trajectory, there's a certain path that we imagine for ourselves. Personally, people think about what type of home they want to build, what type of spouse you want to marry, what type of children you're going to bring to the world, what type of vocation you might cultivate, what type of success you might achieve. But so often, curveballs really derail us, sometimes at a very young age. Whoops. Thank you. And I always go back to that scene in the book of Genesis. Jacob runs away from his brother. He loves a young, beautiful woman named Rachel. He prepares 7 years to marry her, but her father has different plans. And he exchanges one sister for the other sister, and the Torah says they get married. And Jacob consummates the marriage in the tent. It's before Edison's day, so there's no light. I don't know why they didn't light a candle. And then the Torah just gives us one little verse. Vayar baboker v'hinei hileah. Dawn breaks, sun rises, and Jacob says, whoops, it was the wrong one. V'hinei hileah. It was Leah, it wasn't Rachel, right? Do you ever wonder why the foundation of the Jewish people came from that story? It's not just an isolated marriage somewhere in Hawaii. It was this marriage that is the foundation of the entire Jewish world till today. Everyone sitting in this room, or any Jew around the world, is a descendant of Jacob, either of Leah or Rachel, Bilhah, Zilpah, which means the genesis of our people is based on a mistaken marriage. Maybe this is where our dysfunction comes from. Maybe this is where Jewish issues come from. Jacob married the wrong woman, right? And most of the tribes came from Leah, not from Rachel. It's a weird story. And you know, it's brought in books and Sfarim. The reason, if you go to a Jewish wedding today, you'll see that we start with a badekinish. I don't know, what do they call it here? Badekinish? You veil the bride. And one of the reasons is because Leah was veiled. That's why Jacob didn't see her. And my question is, so we should unveil the bride so this doesn't happen again. It's almost like we're perpetuating what happened then. You know, under the chuppah, when the groom places the ring on the finger of his bride and he says, you are betrothed to me, etc., he doesn't even see her. She doesn't see him. For all he knows, it could be Hillary. I don't know. It could be Queen Elizabeth. I have nothing against him. I'm just saying, it could be his shviger. Don't you think that arguably the most important moment of the marriage is when they become a husband and wife and they don't see each other? What does that tell us? But the truth is, there's a very, very profound message here. This teaching comes from the Baal HaTanya. He says something very, very powerful. He says that it's the story of life. It's the story of every marriage. Because every marriage has two dimensions. You know, you meet your husband. You'll raise your hand if this applies to you. If not, you can get out. You date this guy, right? He's impressive, he's charming, he's tall, he's skinny, he's handsome. Seems like he comes from a good family. There is always the husband or the wife that I think I'm marrying. And then there's the husband and wife I end up marrying. Every one of us has a Rachel and a Leah. The Rachel is the marriage I think I'm going into. The Leah is the marriage I actually go into. And what the Torah is saying is, be ready for the fact that the person you dated is not the person you end up marrying. Not because anybody was necessarily deceptive, but it's simply life changes people. And we never really know somebody. So when I veil the bride, I'm saying something very deep. You know what I'm saying? I'm ready to marry not only the person I see, but also the person I don't see. One of the greatest challenges in our culture is we don't want to marry the person we don't see. I only want to marry the person I see. But what can I see when I'm a little baby getting married at this point of life? How much can I see? How much do I even see of myself? Marriage is about the ability not to know the other person, but to say that whatever I know is enough to make a commitment that I want to hold your hand and discover life together. Life is a hike. So dating tells me, find out enough that this is the person you want to go on a hike and discover life together. But that's where the challenge of so many relationships happen, because it's very easy to love Rachel. It's much harder to develop a deep relationship with Leah. Rachel is the spouse I dream of, the spouse I plan, the spouse that fits perfectly into my to-do list. It's the spouse that suits my comfort zones, or as the t-shirt, I'm easy to get along with once you learn to worship me. Leah is the spouse that challenges me, that stimulates me. Leah is the spouse that makes me grow. Leah is the spouse that triggers me and compels me to discover my own skeletons, demons, ghosts. Leah is the spouse that challenges me to be inquisitive about my traumas and to do my own healing work so that I can create space for the other. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? I know the women know what I'm talking about. Do the men know what I'm talking about? Okay, he's nodding very heavily. The story of uncertainty is the story of life. How does Judaism really look at it? How do we really understand this? And for me, one of the most powerful moments of inspiration comes in the book of Esther, in the Megillah that we're all going to read next Wednesday night, exactly 1 week from now, the holiday of Purim. The Talmud in Tractate Chulin, page 139, Kuf Lamed Tes Amud Beis, asks a very strange question. Esther min haTorah minayin. What's the source of Esther in the Torah, in the Bible, in the Chumash, in the 5 books of Moses? It's a strange question. And the Talmud answers, Hanoichi haster aster. That very intense verse at the end of Moshe's life, Moses' life, he says, God says, I will hide my face on that day. Esther means concealment. In Persian, Estara is the moon, which of course shines during nighttime. In Chelam, there was once a debate. What is more important, the sun or the moon? This was a Chelam debate. They debated it for 7 days and 7 nights. The conclusion was the moon is far more important than the sun, because the sun shines during daytime when you don't need it. The moon gives you light when you need it, when it's nighttime. So Esther in Persian and Farsi is the moon. Esther, what is the Talmud trying to say? Esther captures that moment of Jewish history when everything is concealed, when there's absolute uncertainty, when the face of God himself, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is eclipsed. First of all, Esther is the only book in Tanakh that takes place outside of our homeland. Every other book takes place in our homeland. Even the 5 books of the Torah come with the Exodus, going towards homeland. But Esther comes after the destruction of the first temple. The Jews, for the first time in their history, have been exiled. They're under a foreign and alien regime. They're part of the Persian Empire. They're living in Faras, in Shushan, in present-day Iran and Iraq. It's also the only book in Tanakh that doesn't have God's name mentioned even once. It's very strange. This is the Hebrew Bible. Every book is filled with God's presence. Even the Song of Songs is a poem about God and the Jews. And he's mentioned there once. The book of Esther, he's not mentioned even once. At some point, shouldn't have it said the Jews thanked God? Not a word, not a mention of Hashem in Megillah Esther. It's a fascinating thing. The only book in the 24 books of Tanakh. And the theme of the book is about that moment in Jewish history, the first recorded moment in Jewish history when there is a genocidal plan to exterminate every last Jew by Haman. Lahashmid, Larag, La'abed, Eskola, Yehudim. There were 2 people in history who we know had that strategic plan with a real ambition to exterminate every single last Jew. Haman in his generation and Hitler 80 years ago. 2 people that we know. Pharaoh wanted to drown every male infant. And Stalin certainly was one of the greatest anti-Semites who lived in history. And the Roman oppressor certainly persecuted and murdered countless numbers of Jews. But that clear genocidal plan to kill every last Jew. I don't know if you know, I heard this from Mayor Koch once. They were once given a tour in the Berghof, in Hitler's home. And he was taken into one of the offices of Hitler, and he saw there was a very impressive globe. I heard this from Ed Koch. There was a very impressive globe, and on each country there was a number, a black marker that Hitler made. And he saw in Albania there's number 1. So Koch asked, what is this? And the tour guide explained to him that Hitler wrote down in every country how many Jews there are. In Albania, there was 1 Jew. But that Jew had to be killed because somehow he could not rest if that Jew is not killed. Albania, 1 Jew. He had the number of American Jews in 1940. The first person to do this was Haman, and he wanted to do it in 1 day. Lahashmid, Larag, La'abed, Eskola, Yehudim. Such a moment of concealment was unprecedented in Jewish history. Esther herself is in a palace, but everything is concealed. The Jewish flame is about to be extinguished, it seems, for eternity. And it's at that moment, when there's absolute concealment, that there's one verse that can cut through darkness like a dagger. And it comes in chapter 4 of the book of Esther. And I have to say, for me personally, this verse always haunts me in a very positive way. I'm using the word haunts me, you'll see why, but it's in a very positive way. Mordechai pleads with Esther to go to her husband and say to him, I'm a Jew, save my people. You're the first lady after all. And what does Esther respond? Esther says, Mordechai, it's not a good idea. You have to know my husband. He's a Persian drunk. He's an inebriated meshugana. He's an addict. He's a womanizer. He's a tzedreter. He's a paranoid man. He's a narcissist. And he has a rule that if you walk in, I'm adding some words. You're wondering, I never heard this in the Megillah. Just giving a little psychological commentary. But the Talmud intimates all of these features. I did not make them up. I didn't know Achashverosh personally. But I know other Achashveroshes. I mean, we're dealing now with a Putin, so he's an interesting guy. Achashverosh, Esther says, if you go in uninvited, you go out with a head shorter. He hasn't called me in for 30 days. And if you, even the queen, goes in without an invitation, they execute you. So you want me to go into the king, I'm going to be killed, I'll be dead, and the Jews will be dead. It's a pointless plan. And Mordechai responds, a very, very powerful response, and he tells Esther, Al tadami benafshech li molid beis hamelech mikol Yehuda. When the day of reckoning comes in a year from now, when every last Jew is going to be exterminated, don't think you will be spared. Don't think that because you have a position in the royal court of Persia, the SS and the Gestapo are going to spare you. The same dirty, filthy Jew title will be applied to you as well when the day of truth comes. Pretty intense. Then he tells her, Im hacharesh tacharishi beis hazois. If you're silent, the Jews will be saved. Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker. The eternity of Israel was guaranteed by greats before us and after us. But you will forfeit the opportunity. And then he says his final line. And it's obviously the grand slam, the Makabah Patish. His message reaches the crescendo when he tells Esther, Umi yodeya im la'es kazos igat lamalchus. Ibn Ezra explains, Ibn Ezra lived in the 11th century and 12th century in Spain. And in his commentary, he says, what did Mordechai mean? Mordechai meant, who knows if this is not the reason you have become a queen in the first place? It happened years before. The decree of Haman happened already 5-6 years after Esther was a queen. It didn't happen right away. The story of Purim stretches over 12 years. You know, we think it happened in a half an hour. It didn't happen in a half an hour. It happened in more than a decade. But maybe, he says, who knows if this is not the reason you became a queen? Esther, don't you realize it's not a mistake that a Jewish girl was abducted, vatilakach, and taken to the king, and he chose you, and he loves you, and he cherishes you, and you became the first lady of the Persian Empire? It's not a mistake. Mi idea, who knows if this is not the very raison d'etre, the very purpose why this happened to you? And somehow these words cut through Esther's chest like that dagger, and they inspire and they motivate her to the point that now Esther suddenly in a moment is reinvented from a woman who was hesitant, who was so apparently timid and afraid. I can't. You know who I am? I have no standing. I'm just going to be killed. And at that moment, literally, you could feel the metamorphosis, the psychological transformation in Esther's life. From a passive person, she's been passive. The Gemara says, Esther karka olam haisa. It's not just a commentary about intimacy, it's a commentary about life. Esther was passive in the whole story. She couldn't even say who she was. Her very identity had to go undercover. She couldn't even say she was Jewish. What type of life is that? The Talmud says in Megillah, according to one opinion, hechila kadli de chaziri. They served her swine, fat of swine, to nurture her. According to Rashi, she actually ate it. She had no choice. She would have died. Tosfos argues. But the point is, Esther was in a very passive and difficult situation. Not anymore. Something happens to Esther with those words. Suddenly, she becomes more important even than Mordechai. She starts calling the shots. She now tells Mordechai what to do. It's fascinating. Feminists think they invented feminism in 1953. You know, I always tell people, they say, why is it that in Torah the males run the show? I'm like, I don't know which Torah you read, but I'll tell you about the Torah that I read. The book of Genesis, you know, there was once a couple that came to a rabbi and there were shalom bayis issues. The rabbi says to the husband, what's the problem? He says, it's not fair. When we got married, she told me that all the big issues in life, I decide. She decides the small issues. She won't mix into the big issues. But it's not working out that way. The rabbi turns to the wife and says, what happened? She says, yeah, I completely followed through. All the big issues in life. For example, what do we do about Putin? That's up to my husband. He decides. What do we do with the oil crisis? What do we do with the gas crisis? What do we do about global warming? It's a big issue. My husband decides. I do not mix in. What do we do about Iran? My husband decides. The small issues, where we live, where we send our kids to school, how much money I spend on the credit card, what do we do for Pesach, what do we do for vacation, how many pairs of shoes I buy an hour, whatever it is, small, inconsequential decisions that I make and he doesn't mix into. Well, if you look in the Torah, you'll see the big decisions. For example, who decided that Adam should eat from the tree of knowledge, which changed the trajectory of history? Was it a man or a woman? We know who decided. Adam was sleeping. Chava told them what to eat. They still tell us what to eat. That's why the men run to the Kiddush. That's why they have a mechitza in Orthodox shuls. They want to eat when you're not looking, so you don't tell them not to eat the kugel and the rugelach and the babka. Who decided, for example, that Yishmael should be expelled from Avram's home? Who decided? Big decision. We're still dealing with that one. Sarah. Who decided that Jacob, not Esau, should receive the blessings? Rivka. Who decided that Yaakov should marry the wrong woman? Rachel and Leah had to be in cahoots. Who decided that Yehuda should have relations with Tamar? He didn't know what's happening. It was her. Who decided that Yosef should be thrown into a prison, as a result of which he became prime minister of Egypt and saved the world? It was a woman, Potiphar's wife, who decided that little baby Moses should be fetched from the river and saved. A woman, not even a Jewish woman, Pharaoh's daughter. Because in the Tanakh, the men make the small decisions. The women make the big decisions. They have the long-term vision of history. Chachmas nashim ban sabeis, akeres abayis. At this moment, Esther calls the shots. She tells Mordechai, you go gather the Jews, you go make a fast for 3 days. I will fast too. I will go into the king. I will go into the king not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. A new person just emerged. And we all know the rest of the story. As they say, the rest is history, but in this case, it's not history, it's her story. History is his story, but here it's her story. And the book is not called Megillas Mordechai ve'Esther. It's not even called Megillas Esther or Mordechai. It's called Megillas Esther. It's the book of Esther. And the Talmud says in Megillah, page 7, that Mordechai didn't even want the holiday. The sages were not happy with Purim. You know that? Esther is the one who said, Kasvuni ledoros, kavuni ledoros. Write down the story in a book, canonize it in the Tanakh, and make it a holiday. And you know what the sages said? You're going to create anti-Semitism. We Jews are always afraid. You're too Jewish. Too loud, too Jewish. Kina atma reres alano bein umas ha'olam. You're going to create anti-Semitism. And you know what Esther said? You don't know what's happening. Everybody knows the story. The only ones who think nobody knows the story are the Jews. It's like with Israel, right? The only ones who claim that Israel is a regular country is Israel. Nobody else believes it. We have an issue with that. Esther says, the Gentiles know, at least let the Jews figure it out. So it's called Megillas Esther, the book of Esther. I want to understand what created that transformation in her soul. And I think it was that line of Mordechai. Mordechai expanded her horizons. And the moment she got it, everything was transformed, and history was transformed. To put it in different words, Purim often coincides with the portion of this week, which is going to bless next week. The Shabbos is going to bless Purim. The Zohar says every Shabbos blesses the subsequent days. Vayikra. You know, in a Torah scroll, there are certain words that have tiny letters, certain words that have large letters, and most words have regular letters. One of those few words that has a tiny letter is the Vayikra. The opening of the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, read on this Shabbos, read this morning. Vayikra, Vav Yud Kof Resh Aleph. That Aleph, if you look in a Torah scroll, is a tiny little miniature Aleph. You could easily miss it. It means he called out to Moshe, he called out to Moses. And Rashi gives a fascinating interpretation. Rashi takes note, and Rashi says as follows. There are two words in Tanakh that are very similar. When God reaches out to Balaam, the Gentile prophet, the Torah says in the book of Numbers, Vayiker Elokim el Bilam. Vayiker means he chanced upon Bilam. By Moses it says Vayikra, he called out to Moses. What's the difference? The difference is profound. There are two words in the Hebrew language that are literally identical with one letter difference. Mikra and Mikra. You know what Mikra means? Mikra means coincidence. Mem Kuf Reish Hey. It's a coincidence. Mikra Nikra. Things happen randomly. Mikra is with an aleph. You know what it means? A calling. Einstein once said, in life, either nothing is a miracle or everything is a miracle. Either everything is just a random mistake. We're here with Mazel. 15.3 billion years ago, there was a Big Bang, and somehow we still don't know why we had Mazel, and this one singular planet cultivated those factors that support life, and here we are today. 70 trillion cells forming together to create a living organism in the human body, another random mistake. Mikra. Life is all about coincidences. Series of coincidences from the moment of birth through the moment of death, what precedes it and what comes afterwards. That's one vision of life. Moses' vision is Vayikra. It's not a mikra, it's a mikra. It's a calling. But sometimes that calling is anything but obvious because the Aleph, which represents God's name, Aleph is one, Echad, Achdus, Alufo, Shalom, is tiny. Sometimes I cannot see God's presence in history. Sometimes I look and I search, Ichzuch, I'm looking. I'm a mevakesh. I'm trying to find where is the calling. All I see is confusion. All I see is darkness. All I see is uncertainty. All I see is doubt. All I see are random events that have no meaning and no purpose. Sometimes people look at their own personal lives and they go through their life and they say, why did this have to happen and this have to happen? This happened at my childhood. I was 7 years old. I had no choice. But yet my brain was affected. My amygdala has changed forever. My limbic brain has been transformed. The PTSD can still be there in the CAT scan. Who chose these things? These are bad, tragic coincidences. Coincidences that cause trauma, pain, abuse, loss, grief. And they transform the trajectory of a person's life. And when you look for the face of God in it, the Aleph is almost invisible. And yet Moses insists that it's not mikra, it's mikra. There's a calling. And that's the moment the Talmud is addressing when it says that Esther comes from a time of concealment, Haster, Aster. And it's when Mordechai turns to her and sends her this message. I don't see this as a coincidence. I see this, Esther, as a calling. Nothing about your life was a mistake. Esther had a major question. How did this happen? You know, Esther was a valedictorian of Beis Yaakov, or Shulamit, or Bruria, or Neveh, or Beis Ruchel, or Bnei Sion, or Beis Rivka, Beis Sarah, whatever demographic you're from. Esther was a validator. Her trajectory was a great shidduch. She would build a beautiful home in the Five Towns or in Jerusalem. This would be a Jewish home, creme de la creme, with a real Rebbitzin Esther. It even sounds like a Rebbitzин's name. And suddenly she turns into the wife of a Gentile and a drunkard noch. It's like, vu, vas, ven, how did this happen? And Mordechai says, I don't have an explanation. Mi idea, who knows? But what I do know is that none of this is a mistake. None of this is a coincidence. You were chosen. You were sent. You're not a victim of circumstances. You are a shliach of the Ribono Shel Olam. You are an ambassador. You are a messenger. And that changes everything. Not because the circumstances are not tragic, not because the circumstances are not difficult, not because there's no pain, not because there are no questions, but because suddenly I look at every one of those difficult moments, and instead of becoming a victim to my circumstances, I am empowered to see myself as an ambassador. I was sent into this very place in order to do something that only me, with my unique talents and my unique challenges and my unique virtues and my unique blessings and my unique traumas, only I can accomplish right here, right now. I may not understand why me, why now, how it's going to work out. Mordechai says, mi idea, who knows? Once heard from Professor Elie Wiesel, Zichrono Livracha. He was a very close friend of my father. They were both journalists for many years for the Israeli newspaper Yediot Acharot. He was a close friend with our family. And Elie Wiesel once shared a very powerful story. He was the famous Nobel laureate. He was in Auschwitz and Buchenwald. He grew up in Sighet in Romania. Many refugees are being welcomed by the Jewish community in Romania. And he said he had a colleague, a friend, who was a very spiritual young man. And this person is what they call a mevakesh, somebody who really always searched. And he always searched for the reason of creation. And every teacher, every rabbi who would come to town, he would always come to him and say, tell me why? Why am I here? Why was I created? Why did God create the world? Some people don't care about these questions. Some people can't sleep because of these questions. Depends what type of soul you have. But he was one of those souls, and he says, once a big Rebbe came to Sighet, and this young man went into him and said, Rebbe, I will not leave this room until you explain to me why. And the Rebbe said, why what? He said, why everything? Why am I here? What's the purpose of existence? Why was I born? Why did God need this world? What is it all about? And the Rebbe smacked him in his face. And he said, why are you smacking me? And this Rebbe looks at him and says, why would you want to ruin such a good question with some foolish answer? You're asking such a good question. Why would you want me to answer the question? He says, don't you realize it's the answers that divide us. It's the questions that unite us. Mordechai says, mi idea. I have questions. I don't know. Me. The Kabbalists say that me is the numerical value of 50. Mem and Yud, 40 and 10. The Talmud says in Rosh Hashanah that Moses reached 49 gates of wisdom, Mem Tes Shari Bina, like the 49 days of Sfiras HaOmer, not the 50th gate. The Maggid of Mizrich says at the end of his life, he went up to that mountain, Nevo, Har Nevo. Nevo is a combination of two words, Nun Bo. It's on that mountain that he attained the 50th portal of wisdom. Moses ascends two mountains in his life, Sinai and Nevo. From Sinai he comes down. From Nevo he never comes down. He's buried there. We still don't know where Moses was buried. These are the two mountains. I don't know that David Brooks from the New York Times knew about these two mountains when he wrote up his book, The Second Mountain. But the idea is that in life there are two mountains. We climb the mountain of success. I get my degree. I get my first job. I grow in my career. I try to get married. I want to be a prominent member of my community. I want validation. I want prestige. I want honor. I want renown. I want success. I want to relax too. I want a good kiddush. I want a nice shul. I want a comfortable seat in shul. I want a nice family. I want a comfortable life. It's my first mountain. He says, but many people, as they're climbing that mountain, are suddenly overtaken by various curveballs they didn't expect. And they find themselves falling from the first mountain into a cliff. Or some people actually reach the top of the mountain and they see it's not so exciting. They feel empty. Or some people never reach it, but something in life, maybe a divorce, maybe illness, maybe death, maybe a challenge with my children, maybe mental anguish, maybe mental illness. Thank you. You want to maybe give it to me? Thank you so much. And I find myself in an abyss, in a cliff. And what happens now? This is the moment. Do I see it as a coincidence or do I see it as a calling? That's the difference between Bilam and Moses. That's the difference between Esther number 1 and Esther number 2. Esther number 1 is timid and passive and full of doubt and certainty. Esther, the new Esther, is the Esther who starts climbing a second mountain. Miyoideya, Har Nevo, Nunbo. The second mountain is a very different mountain. It's not a mountain where I'm searching for success. It's a mountain in which I ask not what God can do for me. I ask what I can do for God. It's the mountain where I ask not how my children can give me nachas. You know that one? When are you going to give me nachas, kid? When are you going to give me nachas? When will mommy and me be able to go to Florida and look at ourselves and say, wow, these kids are such nachas kinder. The conveyor belt worked so successfully. We hatched them, we matched them, and now we can dispatch them. If your conveyor belt worked that way, Tavei Aleichem Bracha, you're lucky, give us lessons. But it doesn't always work that way. As a teenager told me the other day, Rabbi, why? You think it's easy raising parents today? Mark Twain said, when I was 9, my father was brilliant. When I was 19, he was a moron. He says, now I'm 29, I got a bunch of kids. My father has some brilliant advice. It's funny how much the old man learned in 10 years. Those kids are putting their parents through the ringer today. And suddenly that first mountain is just not working. The first mountain is a mountain where there's very little vulnerability. It's about success. The second mountain is all about vulnerability. The second mountain is all about the fact, as Leonard Cohen once said, when I was young, I worshipped perfection. Today, I only look for things that have cracks inside of them, because it's the cracks that allow the light to come in. The second mountain, I ask very different questions. The second mountain, I'm very human. Second mountain, I'm very vulnerable. Second mountain, there's a simplicity inside of me. The second mountain, I'm humble, but I'm also real. The second mountain, there's a lot of authenticity. It's the type of mountain you see people in real recovery climbing. There's a certain halo of truthfulness that rests around them. And these things are opportunities in life, and that's what Esther understands. Mia idea. In those moments of uncertainty, in those moments of darkness, the Talmud says in Megillah that when Esther walked into her husband, not knowing if she will be executed, she composed chapter 22 of Psalms. Lam Natseach al Ayeles HaShachar, which she says, Keli, Keli, Lama Azavtani. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why have you neglected me? And from that space of abandonment, a new person emerges. A person who looks at life from a completely different perspective. It's very hard to communicate what I'm saying in words, because either you get it or you don't get it. You know what I mean? The women are going like this, and the men are like, get to your point. This is my point, friends. It's not a speech. I know I'm giving a speech, but it's not a speech. Either you feel this in your kishkas, it's visceral, or you don't feel it in your kishkas. I spoke in the last 2 weeks to around 10 rabbinic leaders and rebbitzins from Ukraine, some of them who I knew very well. The rabbi of Mariupol, which is being bombarded now, the greatest crisis is there. Odessa, Kharkiv, Kiev, Chernigov, Sumy. And I'm watching people, some of them I know from yeshiva, I grew up with some of them are younger. And you see transformed people. You see people who in crisis, in bombs, their question is, this one feels there's 35,000 Jews I'm responsible for. You become like just a different person. You ask not what life can do for you. You ask what you can do for life, what you can do for Klal Yisrael, what you can do for the Jewish people. And I spoke to some of their children. And to hear the resilience, the faith, and not because they're denying and they're naive. Some of them were on harrowing journeys. In the beginning, they all decided to stay there. There are 183 Chabad Shluchim who live in Ukraine. That's not individuals, that's families. That's a husband and a wife, and some of them have 9, 10, 11, 12 children, Hasidic style. They built around 40 communities in 40 cities with schools, and they all decided to stay because Putin said he's not targeting civilians. After a few days, they realized he's targeting civilians. Their own homes or shuls or near neighboring homes were bombed. So almost everybody escaped. Some still stay till today. The Rabbi of Dnepropetrovsk, Rabbi Shmuel Kamenetsky, says he's staying till the last Jew was out. Some of them stayed, but most of them had to leave, especially with their children. And I spoke to one of them and I felt that he was calm. I said, why are you calm? Why are you not panicking? It's so difficult. He says it's very difficult, but when you know what your mission is, everything changes. How did Vladimir Zelensky inspire the whole world? It's very interesting what happened. I don't know if you realize. Here's a Jew who was born in 1978, who was a comedian his whole life. A few years ago, I remember there was a dinner in Ukraine and he was the comedian. And this comedian now became a lone lion standing up to Putin, inspiring the whole West to try to do something to stop Putin's invasion. It's like almost a Charlie Chaplin turned into Winston Churchill. Literally. You know, when you heard this comedian, take him seriously, but he inspired the world. You see the power of a Jew. The power of a Jew. The West suddenly realized, hey, there's something still called sacrifice. We forgot about it. The great challenge of our freedom is that people don't have mission statements. Why am I alive? Our ancestors couldn't afford not to have a mission statement. Life was too tough. Life was too challenging. You had to believe in something to survive. What do I have to believe in today? Bupkis, as your grandmother would say. And suddenly he said, there are things worth fighting for. It was classic when America offered him a room in the Ritz-Carlton. Could have been in the King David Hotel, the 8th floor, suite. You could even see the Kaisel. And Zelensky said, I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. Whoa! Somebody still believes in something. Somebody still thinks there are things worth fighting for. This was like an awakening. Our president, he likes to schloff a bissel. What Jews do at sermons. Nobody does this at the sermons here? They're not laughing, not here, okay. I travel sometimes, so rabbis ask me, what's the most important thing to have in a shul? I say, comfortable seats. He says, why? I said, the guy comes Shabbos to schloff. Can't sleep a whole week. The wife macht a meshige. Comes Shabbos to shul. But this is, I know, present company excluded with such a rabbi. It's fascinating what Zelensky did. But now let's apply this to ourselves in every person's life. This is the moment that changes everything. When I can identify the little aleph, that little tiny vayikra, everything becomes different. Friends, there was a moment in Ukrainian Jewish history that I thought about a lot during the last 2 weeks. It's a moment that occurs in 1911, this time of the year, literally this time of the year. On Yud Beis Adar, the 20th of Adar, in Ukraine, near Kiev, in a forest, they found a Christian boy, 12 years old, Andrew Yuchachinsky, stabbed to death. In July, they arrested a Jew by the name of Menachem Mendel Ben Tuvia Beilis, who ran a brick factory in Kiev, accusing him of stabbing the boy to death to use his blood for matzah, for Pesach, because we need blood. That's why he did it in the month of Adar, a month before Pesach. He got to bake matzah. So he did it before Purim. He killed this kid. He was in prison for almost 3 years. All of Russia was consumed with propaganda about the blood that Jews use for Pesach. The court case, the trial began in 1913 in Kiev. And the country was up in arms, and the Jewish world couldn't believe it. We thought 1911 was the era of enlightenment. Of course, today we know better about enlightenment. But then Jews thought in 1911 nobody could believe anymore the blood libels of the Middle Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. It's something of the past. Of course, we were proven wrong. The trial was an incredible trial because the prosecutors tried to prove from the Bible, from the Tanakh, from Bavli, Yerushalmi, from Medrash, from Zohar, from Kabbalah, from Hasidic works, that killing a Christian child is part of Judaism. So this wasn't a trial about Mendel Beilis only. It was a trial about the whole Jewish faith, all Jewish religion, all of Jewish literature, Jewish law, Jewish mysticism, Jewish spirituality, halacha. It was an incredible trial. The rabbinic defender was a man named Rabbi Yaakov Maza. Rabbi Yaakov Maza was the rabbi of Moscow. There was another Jew who's today already of the Yenevelt, had the same name, but he changed it. Jackie Mason. Jackie is Yaakov, and Mason was Maza. So this is just little Jewish trivia. Maza is Mizra Aaron HaKohen. They were Kohenim. Mem Zayin Mizra Aaron HaKohen. Rabbi Yaakov Maza was born in a Chabad family. He became a fervent Zionist. Brilliant oratory skills. He was the defender. The prosecutor threw out a vicious question. Some of you started to learn Maseches Yevamis this week? Okay. So I give you a blessing that you hit Daf Samach Aleph, which is not a guarantee. But those who will be persistent, and you'll hit Daf Samach Aleph, 61, in 60 days, you will come across the following Gemara. The Gemara says as follows. Amar Reb Shimon ben Yochai, Reb Shimon ben Yochai said, we all know that if a corpse is found under a roof, anything under the same roof becomes impure, even though there was no contact. Says Reb Shimon ben Yochai, this is only a Jewish corpse. A non-Jewish corpse will not diffuse impurity unless you touch it. Why? Because the Torah says in Chukas, we're going to read it soon in Parshas Para, Adam ki yamos ba'ayel. Kol asher ba'ayel, kol asher ba'ayel. An Adam that dies under a roof. Atem kriyim Adam ve'enu misa'elam kriyim Adam. You, the Jews, are called Adam. The nations are not called Adam. So therefore, this type of impurity only happens when there's a Jewish corpse. The prosecutor says, you see? Your own Talmud, Yevamos 61, Reb Shimon ben Yochai says, Gentiles are not called people. Of course you can kill a Christian boy. Do you know what Rabbi Yaakov Maza said? He said in Hebrew, every word can both be pronounced in the singular and in the plural. An apple is a tapuach. Apples, tapuchim. A table is a shulchan. Tables, shulchanot. A man is an ish. Men are nashim. A woman is an isha. Women, nashim. Shabbat, shabbatot. Yom tif, yomim tovim. Kisei, kisaot. Madrega, madregot. Etc., etc. Eretz, aratzot. What about the word Adam? Adam is a person. How do you say many people? Anybody? Adamim? No. Adamot? No. There's no plural term for Adam. Which means the term Adam can only be said to a single person. We could say Bnei Adam, the children of Adam. We could speak about Ummah, a nation, Am, Kahal, Tzibur, Shevet, but not Adam. Adam is only one person. So you can't call a nation an Adam. A nation by definition is comprised of many individuals. America has 300 million people. You can't call America Adam. You can say the American people, the American nation, not the American Adam. It's not one person, it's millions. No nation can be called an Adam by definition. The word Adam only applies to an Adam. Like the first Adam was an Adam, and even Chava, it was like Siamese twins, it was one Adam. Zacharu nekeva baram. There's one exception. You, the Jewish people, are called Adam. How? In 1913, there were 18 million Jews in the world. You're one Adam. But Adam is only one person. Rabbi Yaakov Mazza says, look at this trial. If a Russian Gentile peasant was accused of murder, who would be sitting in the courtroom? The defendant, his mother, his lawyer, and maybe his uncle. That's it. Mendel Beilis is an anonymous Jew from Kiev, a secular Jew he was. Came from Hasidic dynasty, from a Hasidic family, he was secular. He had 5 kids. Nobody ever heard of him. He was a very simple person. Who's in the courtroom? Thousands of Jews. In London, they're fasting. In Israel, they're gathering to the shul saying Tehillim. Even in America, they made a day of prayer for Mendel Beilis. Why? What? When? They're not relatives, they're not friends, they never heard his name, they would have never known about him had he not been involved in this trial. Why? Why are they fasting in London in 1913 because a Jew from Kiev is sitting on trial? The answer, Atem Kruyim Adam. There are no 18 million Jews. It's one person. Many limbs, many organs. Rabbi Yaakov Mazza continued. He said, if a Russian Gentile was accused of murder, who would be sitting in the court? Who would be sitting on the Kesi HaMishpat, on the throne of judgment? Who would be brought to court, to trial? Who? This person. Mendel Beilis is accused. You know who's being brought here? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Abaya and Rava, Rashi, Rambam, the Arizal, the Baal Shem Tov. Mendel Beilis never even read any of these works. Meseches Yevamis Samach Aleph, Beilis never looked at Meseches Yevamis. He never read it, he never learned it, even if he opened it, he didn't get to page 61. He doesn't know what Rashbi said, probably doesn't know what Tumas oil is. Very few people know what Tumas oil is. Most Jews, when they hear Tumas oil, they shut down emotionally. Why is Reb Shimon ben Yochai being brought to court? What does Mendel Beilis have to do with Meseches Yevamis Samach Aleph? The answer is, Atem Kruyim Adam. Every Jew from Abraham till Mashiach is one organism. And when Mendel Beilis does something, who's taking responsibility for it? Every Jew who ever lived. Says, don't you see this is the only nation who can be called Adam? Parenthetically, I once heard from Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, Zechrono Livracha, the Chancellor of YU. He told me that in 1976 he went on a cruise with his wife on the Pacific. This is before the days of kosher cruises, so if you went on a cruise, you had to take a doggy bag with tuna and sardines. You remember those days? You don't remember. So he took a doggy bag, and he went on his wife. It was July 1976, and on the radio the news came about Entebbe. He said on the ship there was a Jew who was assimilated, completely secular. He had a very Jewish name. It happened to his name been Mendel. He was a waiter on the cruise. The staff on the cruise ship were so excited about what Israel did, they wanted to express their passion. So what they do, they took this secular Jew Mendel, a waiter, they put him on their shoulders and they paraded him throughout the ship to salute Israel for rescuing the hostages in Uganda. And Dr. Lamb tells me, he says, what in the world is Mendel, a waiter on a cruise ship in the Pacific? Why is he taking credit for a decision of Yitzchak Rabin, Shimon Peres, and Yoni Netanyahu, Hashem Yinkom Damai, and the other crew who went there? What's the connection? The answer is Atem Kruyim Adam, one person. Different demographics, different persuasions, different walks of life, different people, different opinions. But one person, Adam. A body has 70 trillion cells. Klal Yisrael is one superorganism that has many different cells, many neurons. The Rav Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik Zatzal once said, the Talmud says in Menachos, if a child is born with 2 heads, chas v'shalom, which one do you put tefillin on? So Tosfos says it happened. There was a child born with 2 heads, and in a classic Jewish case, his father died. He wanted a double portion of the inheritance. Father had a lot of real estate in the 5 towns, and on 5th Avenue, and in Borough Park. So he said, I got 2 heads, yeah? So I have 2 Yiddish cups. So I get a double portion of the inheritance. So they come for a din Torah to King Solomon. So what does King Solomon say? Shlomo Melech, what does he say? He says, blindfold one of the heads and pour hot cholent on the other one. If the other head that's blindfolded screams, then it means it's one person and he only gets 1 portion of the inheritance. But if the other head doesn't scream, then it's 2 people and he gets a double portion. So Rabbi Yoshe Soloveitchik said, what type of verdict is this? We blindfold somebody, we start pouring hot cholent? It doesn't say cholent in Tosfos, it says cham, in hot water. So Rabbi Yoshe said something very powerful. He said, Klal Yisrael doesn't have 1 head. We have multiple heads. Every Jew thinks differently about things. I once heard myself from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, of blessed memory, said, why is it that by Jews I say Shalom Aleichem, and your response is Aleichem Shalom? Why don't you reciprocate? Shalom Aleichem, Shalom Aleichem. Imagine in English I would say good evening, and you would say evening good. How are you? You are how? What's up? Up what's? Meshiga. In Hebrew we all do it. Shalom Aleichem, Aleichem Shalom. So he said, because when 2 Jews meet, even before they start the conversation, the first thing they have to establish is that there is an argument. Shalom Aleichem. No! Chas v'shalom, that's kfira. Aleichem Shalom. Once we establish that we have an argument, now we can begin to have a normal conversation. So the Rav Rabbi Yoshe Rabbi Soloveitchik said, Jews don't have 1 head. We have multiple heads. And I would add, even in one Jew himself or herself, there are multiple heads. Once heard from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory. He had a public debate with Amos Oz. Amos Oz stood at the left of Israeli culture, a literary genius, and he debated Lord Sachs, British chief rabbi. So before the debate, Amos Oz says, Rabbi Sachs, before we begin, I have to say, I will probably disagree with everything you're going to say. You know, that's how Jews begin debates. You didn't even hear what I had to say. But I know, I look at you, and already a stereotype, I will disagree, Rabbi Sachs, with everything you say. But I want to tell you something else. I will probably disagree with everything I say too. Jews don't have 1 head. We have multiple heads. You know Isaac Bashevis Singer's story? You remember Isaac Bashevis Singer? So he has a story that the Jews from Chelm decided to send somebody to Vilna to see what a great Jewish city looks like. He comes back from Vilna, they say, "Nu." He said, I went into shul, unbelievable what I saw. I met a Jew who was a believer. I met a Jew who was an agnostic. I met a Jew who was an atheist. I met a Jew who was a capitalist. I met a Jew who was a socialist. I met a Jew who was a communist. I met a Jew who was a Bundist, Yiddishist, Zionist. I met a right-winger. I met a left-winger. I met a parochial Jew. I met a universal Jew. I met a religious Jew. I met a secular Jew. Almost religious, almost secular, centrist, right, left. An ignorant Jew, a knowledgeable Jew, illiterate, literate. They said, what's the big deal? We have all these Jews here too. He says, no, it was all the same person. So Rabbi Yoshe said we have multiple heads, but that's not the problem. The problem is not that we have different heads. The problem, he said, is as follows. When you pour hot water on one of the heads and the other head cries out in pain, that means it's Adam. You're one person. You may have different heads, but you're one person. The tragedy is when I pour hot water on one head and the other head is apathetic, indifferent. He says, this is the tragedy. It's not just we think differently. Now there's a detachment. And that undermines the core of Jewish existence. The fact that Jews argue with each other is not a tragedy. The whole Talmud is based on a culture of argument. Every Jewish marriage, okay, that was a bad one. Many Jewish marriages are based on a culture of argument. The Netziv says, Eseloi Ezer Kenegdai. Sometimes the best way you help a man is by disagreeing with him. This wasn't for you. You'll do it anyway. I'm telling them, when somebody disagrees, Nish Geferlich Ezer Kenegdai. We can disagree with each other, but we always have to be able to be here for each other. Good marriages are not marriages in which husbands and wives don't disagree. Please. 70% of arguments that you had during Sheva Brachos, you're going to have when you're 99 years old in Palm Beach. Where do we go for Pesach? Do we shut the blinds? Do we shut the lights? Milchik restaurant, Fleischik restaurant, comedy, drama. Most arguments you have forever. The difference in a good marriage and a bad marriage is not if you argue, it's how you argue. It's if I feel that in the argument we are here for each other. It's an Adam. It's one person, it's one organism, even if there are different advantages, different vantage points, and different compartments. And let's face it, it's been one of the great challenges of Jewish history. There is a trauma happening now in the Jewish world. People don't realize this, and I'm just telling you what I think. We all know the truth. 80 years ago, American Jewry did not respond to the Holocaust the way it should have. It did not. Of course, Jews are Jews. We cared. People said Tehillim. Some people gave money. There was a Vad Hatzalah. But ultimately, the Jewish community went on with business, and with good excuses. What was my name? Roosevelt? What's my name? Churchill? What am I supposed to do? Roosevelt is running the world. Churchill is running the world. They're the enemies of Hitler. Between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, what is a simple American Jew supposed to do besides take care of his family, go to work, celebrate life, and live on, and say a kapitel tehillim and give a little tzedakah? But this sits in all of our psyches. Now you'll say, what could have been done? I don't know. Ultimately, God runs the world. But this is something that sits in the psyche of American Jews. The American press was apathetic. American Jewish communities were somewhat passive. And when this crisis happened now in Ukraine, it triggered this memory. If you look into your own psyche, you'll see what I'm saying. And the truth is, if you want to understand the difference, it's two scenes in Bereshis. When God asks Cain, where's your brother? He says three words, Hashemer achi anochi. I'm the custodian of my brother. I'm not the custodian of my brother. What do you want from me? That's Cain. A few portions later, Yosef, and the brothers don't like him. He goes searching for his brothers to find out how they are because his father sent him to them. And he gets lost. And somebody finds him in Parshas Vayeshev. And he says, Ma tevakesh, what are you searching for? And Yosef says four words, Es achai anochi mevakesh. I'm searching for my brothers. That's the moment Jewish history begins. Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? I have to pay a mortgage, I have to pay tuition. You know what tuition is this year for me? Should I tell you? You're not interested. You got your tuition to pay. Probably 5 towns is more than Muncie, right? You know, I can't deal with my brother's a girl. Come for the chasana. That's Cain. He killed him too, but that wasn't part of the discussion. Yosef says, I search for my brothers. They'll throw him into a pit. They sell him as a slave. He never stopped searching for his brothers. And when he met them, he could forgive them and he could say, you didn't sell me, God sent me. And that is the genesis of Jewish history. 80 years ago, 85 years ago, there was an attitude. Am I the custodian of my brother? I feel horrible. Today, the Jewish people are feeling as achei anochi mevakesh. 350,000 Jews in Ukraine left homeless in a few nights. And even though most of us don't have relatives or friends in Ukraine, many of us don't know anybody in Ukraine, something is stirred in the Jewish psyche. And there's a reason for it, because it's one person, because we are family. I don't know if you saw, somebody sent this to me. It was so moving. My wife sent this to me a few days ago. Nathan Sharansky was born in Ukraine, on the border. And he became the famous refusnik, fighting the Soviet communist regime, wanting to go to Israel, wanting to practice Judaism, because till 91, Ukraine is part of the Soviet Union. In 91, Ukraine becomes an independent country, which Putin is obviously upset about. So Sharansky is a Ukrainian Jew. Ultimately made it to Eretz Yisrael, made it to Israel after so many years. So he spoke last week at the Sheva Brachas of Yossi and Chana Dickstein's wedding. Yossi Dickstein lost both of his parents and a brother to Arab terrorism. He was 7 years old when his father, mother, and brother were gunned down during the second horrific intifada that Yasser Arafat, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, unleashed. He got married now. It's big Simcha. So Sharansky came to the Sheva Brachas. At the Sheva Brachas, Nathan Sharansky said the following. He says, I grew up in Ukraine, in the city of Donetsk. There were people of many nationalities living there, but this is under the Soviet Union. And he says their ID certificates had the word Russian, Ukraine, Georgian, Kazakh, but it wasn't that important, and there wasn't much of a difference. We were all part of the Soviet Union. There was one thing that was important. If you had on your certificate, on your birth certificate, one word, Yevreiska. Yevreiska meant you were Jewish. That meant that you had a disease, a genetic disease. That meant you had to be careful. That meant you would be persecuted. That meant you were likely to be thrown into the gulag or lose your job or be targeted for abuse and persecution. He said, we knew nothing about Judaism. There was no Jewish education, no shul, no infrastructure, no mitzvahs, nothing. One thing we knew is that if you're a Jew, you're diseased because you're going to be hated because there's anti-Semitism. He said that's why nobody tried to replace the word Russian or the word Ukraine in order to get accepted to the university because it was fine. But if you had the word Yevreiska on your ID papers and you could manage to change that, it was a miracle, because that means your chances to get accepted into a good university and get a career, which was the dream of every Russian Jew, even more than American Jews, could be experienced. You could have luck. He says, and then something happened this week. He said, I was reminded of all of this as I was seeing hundreds of thousands of people standing at the borders of Ukraine trying to get into other countries. They stand there day and night, and there is only one word today that gets you out faster than anybody else, and that is Jewish. If you're a Jew, there are Jews outside who care for you. There is someone on the other side of the border looking for you. The chances of getting out are so much higher. The world I knew has been turned upside down. When I was a child, Jewish was a curse. It was an extraordinarily bad word. Nobody was jealous of us. Today, at the borders of Ukraine, Jewish is an extraordinary word for goodness. It describes people who have somewhere to go, and there is an entire nation, their family, in Israel and elsewhere, waiting for them outside. The fact, I myself know around 20 or 30 friends who are now at the borders that created makeshift hotels, housing literally thousands and thousands of Jews, bringing them to Israel or to the countries around Ukraine. Every one of those 183 Chabad Shluchim and their families, unsung heroes, together with the other organizations of various Jewish organizations helping out. But you're talking about an incredible shift. We cannot afford anymore to say those words, am I my brother's keeper? Our motto before the Geula is, Es achai anochi mevakesh. And not just brothers in Ukraine, my brother also across the street, the teenager who's struggling in shul, my nephew, my niece, my own child. Every brother and sister, every Jew I meet, whether I agree or I don't agree, whether he's part of my nusach or not part of my nusach, whether he looks like me or she looks like me, whether we agree about everything or we don't agree about 99% of things, it's an Adam, it's one person. And today, if you're experiencing, what you're experiencing is that consciousness and that thirst and that yearning. And when we feel this helplessness, what am I supposed to do? It's because there's an Adam. If your brother, your sister, your child was stranded, there's that, what I need to do. Es achai anochi mevakesh. And yes, at such moments, remember Mordechai's words, Mi yodeya im la'es kazoi sigat lamalchus. If I'm ambitious, if I'm searching, if I want, God will provide every single one of us with the opportunity to do our little part in being there for our brothers and sisters. One person does it financially, another person does it through the pen, another person does it through their mouth, another person does it through different connections, another person does it through influence, through alliances, through diplomacy. Every person knows in their heart of hearts, every person can accomplish some person, another person takes a Tehillim and prays to the Ribono Shel Olam every day for our brothers and sisters, and another person adds a mitzvah, and another person adds an Avos Yisrael, another person adds in tzedakah, another person adds in Torah. But when you in exercise, when you strengthen one limb, you don't strengthen one limb, you strengthen the whole body. Nobody says, oh, I'm doing something for my heart. It's only for my heart. There's a circulatory system. You strengthen one demographic, one community. Jews empower themselves anywhere in the world. It empowers every Jew in the whole world, including our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. During the Holocaust, there was a Ukrainian woman. She was not Jewish. Her name was Maria Bilshchik. Maria Bilshchik. She knew a Jewish girl by the name of Fanya Bas. I don't know if you know this history, but during Hitler invaded Russia, June 22nd, 1941, Chav Zayin Sivan Tovshin Aleph, early morning, Sunday. And the Einsatzgruppen followed the Wehrmacht, and they went from shtetl to shtetl, from city to city, from village to village. And they gathered every man, woman, and child who was Jewish and shot them. This was the Holocaust of bullets, during which between 1.6 million and some say 2.5 million Jews were murdered by bullets. Almost every shtetl has mass graves with thousands of Jewish bodies right there outside of the city in the Ukraine. Some escaped. The Nazis did it with the help of Ukrainian anti-Semites. One of the most tragic stories in Jewish history, and not so known. How those shchitas happened. It's beyond horrific. Fanya Bas was a girl. And this Maria Bilshchik took her in. She hid her in her home. Of course, if the Nazis caught you, you were murdered. Your whole family was murdered for hiding a Jew. But she ensured her survival. Fanya survived. Fanya Bas has granddaughters. She has a granddaughter, one granddaughter whose name is Sharon Bas. She lives in Israel. And her grandmother always remained connected to her angel, to the woman in Ukraine who saved her. Last week, Fanya Bas's granddaughter Sharon found out that Maria has two granddaughters who are in Ukraine in a war zone and need to be saved. So Sharon reached out and secured their journey from Ukraine to Israel. And here's a picture of these two I don't know if you'll see it, somebody just sent me, here's a picture of these two granddaughters of Ukraine arriving to Israel. And the granddaughter of the woman who was saved by their grandmother greets them in Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. Maria was honored by Yad Vashem years ago as one of the righteous among the nations, Chassidium Esa'olam, for saving this girl. But now her granddaughter saved those two granddaughters from war-torn Ukraine. We never know the plans of history. What we do know is one thing. when you were born, when I was born, where you are, your opportunities, your gifts, and your challenges, your talents, resources, and difficulties are all with hashgacha. It's all by divine providence. And when I wake up in the morning, I have that choice, a very profound choice. Either I become a victim of my circumstances, I eat up the news, I read the news, but I'm a passive bystander. They say there are three types of people. There are people who make things happen, people who watch things happen, and people who want to know what happened. It's a choice we make every day. Will I be one of those people who says, what happened? Oh, you woke up. Shekayach, bruchim abayim, shalom aleichem. Or I will watch things happen and become a very, very interesting commentator. But the role of the Jewish people from Avram Avinu till today is to make things happen. You can learn from Vladimir Zelensky in his own way, who made things happen, and each in our own way, to be able to seize the moment, carpe diem, to become an ambassador of truth, an ambassador of love, an ambassador of hope, an ambassador of healing, an ambassador of authenticity, an ambassador of compassion, and an ambassador of redemptiveness. Send him my love and tell him I'm searching for my brothers. I want to conclude my remarks with thanking profoundly my dear friends who have created this beautiful evening, not knowing they wouldn't be here. They would be in Israel because of their own unexpected situation, not knowing, of course, the circumstances in which our world would find itself right now. But I really want to thank Elliot and Marilyn Lauer for putting together this beautiful evening in loving memory of both of their parents, Reb Gershon ben Eliezer, Dvora bas Moshe Yosef, Yehuda ben Yitzchak Gdalya, Yehudis Liba bas Simcha, הכוהן. Thank you, thank you, thank you for bringing us all together. And we all join in prayer for your son, for a refuah shleimah, for complete and speedy recovery, for Simcha Yitzchak, but Mirela Leyatkah, for Sam Lauer, to be able to have a complete and speedy recovery and enjoy many, many long, happy, healthy, prosperous years in Eretz Yisrael, in the Holy Land where you are now. And may all of us be able to this year declare together L'Shana Haba, and already this year, be Yerushalayim. Thank you very, very much.